Welcome back. In this video we're going to continue working on the Desert Sand shader. If you didn't follow along with the last video, you can use the file desert environment displacement _end, which was attached to the last lecture. Now this Voronoi texture at the moment looks fine. One thing you might want to change here is change this to smooth F1 if you want something that's a little bit more like dunes without so much of a sharp edge, and you can always tweak the smoothness to get something right in the middle. So you could go from that sharp effect to a slightly smoother effect. That's entirely up to you. I'll keep this on smooth F1, but I'll turn the smoothing all the way down because I do want those sharp peaks. And the next thing we might want to do is just add in another level of noise here. So I'll grab a noise texture. Once again, I'm going to use the same mapping. And we're going to use a mix node here. So we'll just use our classic trick of Control-Shift, right-click, to add that mix. And we're adding this in on top. Let's try and multiply. Let's take this factor down. Now let's have a look at this noise texture. So the scale on this noise, we could stand to have that a bit higher. We don't want too much detail or roughness here either. So we'll turn these settings down and just look through our principal nodes. So we're getting a little bit more variety happening there. And we can just tweak our factors. So this is without any of that bump map. This is with quite a bit of it. And that's obviously a lot of it. So maybe just want that down to about this setting. So we're just getting a slight adjustment to our displacement map, taking these peaks as well and making them less straight and giving them more of an interesting edge. So I quite like the look of that. Now let's go back to our sand for the moment. Now our sand color is really kind of white, and I think I want to go for a more orangey sand texture. So I have some reference here, and you can see a lot of these desert sands are much more orange, very saturated as well. So let's go into color, grab a hue saturation value node. We can increase our saturation first of all, just to get our color right. Now at the moment it's very, very yellow. Let's take our hue and just adjust that down a little bit. And a little bit of adjustment on the hue does a lot. Let's take it down to maybe 0.44 and then take our saturation back just a little bit. Take that back to about 1.5. Now if you're struggling with hue saturation and value, because it can be a little bit tricky to work with, another option would be as if we just take our result and our base color, plug them together, do a color mix node. What we're going to do is set this to color. And then we can just choose a new color from here. So this orange that I've grabbed here on my overlays is very similar to this orange. So if I just grab this as an example and use a color picker and just grab this, now we can actually just overlay that orange color on top. You can always tweak this and make it more of an orangey red, desaturated, and I think for the moment I quite like that color. Now one thing that we do have to worry about is the scale of our sand. If we zoom right in, you can see it looks nice and grainy, looks quite nice, but the scale is really too large for this environment. So I'm going to show you a little trick. At the moment in our bump map we have 3 different scales, and we want to be able to use one control to change all those scales. So we're going to grab a value, we're going to set this to 1, and then we're going to grab a math node. We're going to set this to multiply, and we're going to choose this first scale here, which is 500. Type that in. We're going to duplicate this. Type in 250. We're going to duplicate this once more. Type in 100. And now we can plug this value up to each of these nodes in value 1. And then plug each of these values into their respective scales. And now what we should be able to do is change this value to 2, and it will automatically adjust all 3 of these values. And then we can get a scale that works a little bit better. So I think maybe a scale of about 5 could work. So let's zoom in a little bit. And yeah, we have to really zoom in before we start seeing any of that grain, which is exactly what we want to see, because if we look at our reference images, particularly ones like this just looks like a smooth surface. It doesn't really look as if it has any grain at all or any kind of bump. And that's one reason why our bump setting here, our strength, we actually probably want to decrease that. So I'm going to decrease that to about 0.5 and just take off some of that bump. So everything's a bit smoother. You could even maybe stand to decrease that down even further to maybe about 0.1. And I quite like the look of that at the moment. Now, the only other thing I want to add in there is a slight waviness to our dunes. Now, potentially we could do this in displacement, or we could do it in the bump map. It's really up to you. Doing it in the displacement would obviously mean that we have to have a much higher dicing setting in order to get all that fine detail. Otherwise, it would just get lost on our low poly mesh. Doing it in the bump will work a lot better, but it might mean that we have to make some more adjustments to our initial bump map. But let's just get the map sorted first of all. So I'm going to use a Voronoi texture. We're going to use Control T for our mapping. And again, we're using object. We already have a node set to object, so we can just use that. Let's just go into our Voronoi texture. You can see the scale of that. Very small. Let's take that down to about 0.1. And I think that might be too low a scale. Let's try 1. And I think that might be too high, so let's try 0.5. This could work for us. Now let's try this first in bump. So we're going to do that daisy chain trick again. We'll grab this distance and plug it into height. Now this strength is going to have to be really small, because at the moment this is what we're getting. Really not what we want at all. Let's take that strength down to about 0.1. We can barely see that. And this Voronoi texture, at the moment we are set to 3D. Let's change that to 2D. Let's also change from F1 to smooth F1. And now we want to take this scale. We can do it in X or Y. And we want to increase this to stretch out this Voronoi texture. And that way we start getting more of a kind of wave texture there. We can maybe even change that to 10. And as far as the scale goes, I think we still need to adjust that a little bit. Let's take that back. Try it down a little bit, try it up a little bit, until you get the size of waves you're looking for. So something like that might be okay. I think 10 might actually be too much. Change that to 5. And that's okay. Now I don't want these going up in this direction, so I'm going to rotate these by 90 degrees. This is one of the reasons I changed this to 2D. And then if we go into our Voronoi texture, in fact, you can see if we rotate this around, we're not quite getting the effect we want. Let's change this to texture. Now if we rotate this around, we actually do get the effect we want. Obviously our scales are now off, so we'll have to adjust that, but let's do that when we can see what we're doing. Go back into our camera view. This is often something that you'll have to do. You get some settings right, you change one thing, realise that the way you've set it up doesn't quite work for what you're trying to achieve, and then you have to start adjusting things again. So let's take that scale back up. That scale looks actually pretty spot on. Let's try about 2.5, just so we'll get a round number. I quite like the look of that. I think they need to be stretched out a little bit more. Let's try a scale of 10. I quite like that. That's looking good. It could stand to be a little bit stronger. So we'll go back up to our bump. We'll change that bump to about 0.2. And I'm actually pretty happy with that. Now, without going in and doing any other manipulation of the mapping, giving some distortion so these kind of wave a little bit, that is about as close as we're going to get. Maybe the strength is a bit too high. Let's try 0.15. Okay, and actually I think that's pretty good. And there's not really anything else I want to change in this. As I said, we can use this in bump or we could use it in displacement. If we use it in displacement, let me show you how that would look. Let's just get rid of that node. And what we would do is we would just do an overlay here. So we would use color, mix color, drop this down here, and we'll drop this on top. And you can see immediately we get this crazy result. Obviously, we want to take this factor way, way down. And you can see the effect we get there is just not that great. If we do a render, we should get something a little bit nicer, but I won't really expect it to be that much better. Yeah, you can see it's even a few samples in, it's really too strong. So this isn't likely to be an effect you would use on displacement unless you're a lot closer to the surface of the object. So let's just get rid of that next node, plug this height back in, and then plug this distance back into our bump map. And now we've got a much nicer result. Okay, so it's challenge time. Another very simple challenge this time. Just tidy up the node tree by using frames, colors, and labels to arrange your nodes a little bit and make them a little bit more readable to anyone using your texture in the future. Once you're happy with your shader and the layout of the node tree, just add it to your material library by marking it as an asset. In the next video, we're going to move on to an even more challenging procedural texture. So I'll see you then.